Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Council of the Americas Democracy Dialogues, a conversation we need to be having now about the state of democracy in the Americas. I'm your series host, Eric Farnsworth. As we cross the threshold into 2022, we have to acknowledge an inconvenient truth. Democracy in the Americas has retrenched. At the first Summit of the Americas in Miami in 1994, the only one hemispheric nation was a dictatorship. Today, there are three, and others are also exhibiting worrisome signs. And even as democracy is challenged elsewhere, we also need to acknowledge that the ability of the United States to promote the democracy agenda has been tarnished by the events of January 6, 2021. We must also recognize that, unlike previous years, Washington is no longer the only option for consideration. And so for our first dialogue this year, we want to take stock of where we are broadly in the hemisphere, but we also want to focus on developments in what is arguably the most critical nation in Latin America for the United States, Mexico. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome a widely sought-after expert who's also a long-standing personal friend, Ambassador Arturo Sarukhan. Arturo is a former Mexican ambassador to the United States, among many other roles, and he's a keen observer of the bilateral relationship as well as the global democracy agenda. He's currently a strategic consultant to businesses in the United States, Mexico, and across the Americas. Normally, Arturo, we'd be hosting you in person here in our studio in Washington, but because of the Omicron variant, of course, we're unable to do so, but we do appreciate your willingness to join us even from a remote location. I guess the good news is we don't have to be wearing our masks as we're talking to each other today. Arturo Sarukhan, welcome to the Democracy Dialogue.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. And we're blocks away, but at least we're doing this as scheduled.
Absolutely. Well, let's jump into it. Give us your sense. Here we are in 2022. What's the state of democracy in the Western Hemisphere? Should we be optimistic or pessimistic or something else based on the trend lines that we view today?
Well, it's certainly not peachy, Eric. Starting with here in the U.S. and in Washington, D.C. You mentioned it. The 6th of January of last year, I think, has thrown a shadow over not only this country, but over the Americas and certainly liberal democracy elsewhere, because unlike Las Vegas, what happens in the U.S. doesn't stay in the U.S. The democratic degradation that we've been seeing, it has an impact, has a domino effect in other parts of the world. It has an effect and an impact on the geopolitical calculus of other nations. It has an impact on how some of the countries in the Americas look at and articulate democracy and liberal democracy, a liberal democracy of checks and balances, which is being seriously challenged across the Americas. To add to that, you've got an administration that has put strengthening democracy at home and abroad at the top of its agenda, but it's doing so with one hand tied behind his back as certain sectors in the GOP continue to torpedo the foundations of democracy in the United States. Some countries, there's been further backsliding. Nicaragua is the most painful and obvious case recently, but things haven't improved in the usual suspects, Venezuela, Cuba. You've got some, I think, important concern regarding some of the trend lines in Mexico. On the other hand, you've got some interesting things happening. We will all be watching carefully as Chile transitions into Boric's new government, and that will be very interesting to see. He said some interesting things about issues which tend to be near to left-wing governments in the region regarding democracy and human rights. We'll see how it starts playing out. But certainly, I think that my greatest concern at this stage, Eric, and it's something that you've been addressing at the Council of the Americas a lot in the last months, is how the socioeconomic impact, the disruption of COVID and the impact of the pandemic on the social contracts of many nations across the Americas will unfold in the coming months as some of the countries and the economies start trying to reactivate their economic performance, and some of those tensions are already manifest in what I think is one of the most pressing and concerning issues we're facing in the hemisphere today, which is the historical, unprecedented number of people on the move, whether it's internally displaced, whether it's migrants, whether it's refugees. And it's not only on the US-Mexico border, it's happening across the Americas. And this is something that we have to keep our eyes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's having huge political implications in some of these elections that you've mentioned. Indeed, I'm really glad that you raised Chile. I'd also throw in Honduras. These are two elections that were free and fair, and where the candidates were freely elected. And, it will be interesting to see which direction they go. That's right. But in terms of the institutionality of democratic practice, I think that they were positive examples of what can be achieved in the region. At the same time, you mentioned Nicaragua, which clearly has went the other direction on November 7th. So we do have a mixed bag. I totally agree. Well, let's move into the real question at hand today, and that's Mexico. In the 1990s, Carlos Salinas wanted to bring Mexico into the modern age, if you will, in terms of connecting with the United States and Canada in the NAFTA arrangement, bringing Mexico squarely into North America, but also continuing Mexico in terms of its position geographically and culturally in Latin America. And so you had some of the traditional ways of doing things overlaid now with the new democratic expectation. And I wonder, given now almost 30 years of experience along those lines, how you see Mexico and the year ahead as we go forward for that very, very important and critical country.
Yeah, clearly, Carlos Salinas' bet was a strategic sea change for Mexico and for Mexico's relationship with the U.S. We're still living some of those effects, as first NAFTA and then 9/11, a completely extra hemispheric event, something that had nothing to do with the bilateral agenda, profoundly impacted the security and national security intelligence dialogue and engagement between both countries, simply, obviously, by the simple and powerful fact that we share a common 3,000 kilometer border. But I am a bit concerned as we head into 2022, particularly in terms of what's happening in Mexico. I think that as President Obrador moves into his third year in office, I fear we're going to see a doubling down of many of his pet peeves and pet projects. My greatest concern has always been that Obrador, who cut his teeth politically in the PRI of the 60s and 70s, a very nationalist view of Mexico, of the role of the state, will probably continue to seek to erode, to weaken the checks and balances that have been painstakingly built in Mexico over 3-4 decades. Whether it's his assault on Mexico's national electoral authority, the Instituto Nacional Electoral, INE, whether it's some of the things that we've seen in his whittling down of regulators, which are a critical component of providing and ensuring a level playing field for businesses in Mexican and foreign operating in Mexico, whether it's the role of academic autonomy and the role of academic and scientific institutions in Mexico, which have borne the brunt of his latest diatribes from the bully pulpit in his daily press conferences. Look, I'm not suggesting here that we're on the cusp of a democratic breakdown in Mexico, but what we are seeing is a slow degrading of the checks and balances that sometimes have worked better, sometimes have not worked as well or as intended, but which have allowed Mexico to transition slowly in becoming a fuller democracy while still imperfect. And these are some of the issues that I'm concerned about heading into 2022. I think we will see the president sort of thinking about one particular issue as he moves forward in the second part of his administration, which is how does he Teflon coat and protect what he sees as the legacy of his so-called fourth transformation. And I'm a bit worried, and I'm a bit worried also that Washington has not quite picked up what's going on and the impact of some of these policies, not only in terms of Mexico's well-being, prosperity, and security, but critically because of the intermestic nature of U.S.-Mexican ties, how all of that can impact the well-being and security of the United States.
Well, let's probe that exact point, because, from the Washington perspective, and I say this now as a former White House official, former State Department official, I worked at USTR, so Mexico looms large in all of those contexts. We, the United States, Washington, official Washington, normally view Mexican issues as issues to be managed. We don't necessarily look at the opportunity in terms of relationship with Mexico. We focus on migration, we focus on security, we focus on trade, oftentimes trade disputes. All of those are important, don't misunderstand. But when we do that, what do we miss in terms of the internal dynamics of Mexico? What should we be more attuned to in terms of Mexico's own dynamics, just along the lines that you are beginning to tease out?
Yeah, I think one of the greatest issues that I've been looking at lately is strategic traction in the relationship. And there's a bit of a paradox, because there's a huge strategic opportunity. Part of it has to do with what I think is the most important national security foreign policy recalibration that the United States has undergone since the end of the Cold War, which is relations with China, and the role that Canada and Mexico play in that recalibration, particularly in terms of the economic, trade, digital, cyber security relationship with China, are critical. Washington will only be successful in recalibrating relations with China if it fully includes and understands the role that Canada and Mexico need to play in enhancing North American competitiveness, in enhancing our digital economy. The NAFTA was built on the manufacturing and automotive sectors in particular. The future success of the USMCA is going to be digital, Eric. And Canada and Mexico, again, whether it's in 5G or electronic vehicles or tablets or chips or cybersecurity issues, Mexico and Canada have to be in the core of how Washington recalibrates that relationship with China. So, and I'm not even going into the issue that was so apparent, painfully apparent, in 2019 when the pandemic broke out, which is our integrated supply and production chains and how those were affected by the fact that Washington, Mexico City, and Ottawa went their own way, designated essential sectors, national security sectors, and forgot to think for a moment that if we didn't coordinate that designation and ensured symmetry of what we were each country designating as national security sectors, we were going to deepen the disruption of those supply chains, and that's what exactly happened in 2019. So because of all of this, there's a huge strategic opportunity, but also there's a pressing need for Washington, Ottawa, and Mexico City to think about it. I think the three capitals have started to talk the talk, but I haven't seen evident signs that they're walking the walk in this regard.
Yeah, and I think your the North American agenda, I think it's still there, waiting to be pursued in a meaningful way. I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely, and that's why I think it was so important the Biden administration decided in what the Biden administration has been doing, which is rebuilding the architecture of diplomatic ties with Mexico, with Canada, in North America, after 4 years of a hiatus on most of these critically important mechanisms. The fact that the Biden administration reconvened the North American Leaders Summit was a very important step. But now we've really got to move forward between now and the summit this year in Mexico City, because that agenda can't wait. But then at the same time, you've got two very particular dynamics happening in Mexico City and in Washington, D.C. In Mexico City, it must be said, I think López Obrador is certainly a different man from the one that campaigned in 2006 and 2012, when he in fact criticized NAFTA, didn't quite get the impact that NAFTA had for the economic prosperity and well-being of Mexico, the López Obrador that ran in 2018 and the López Obrador that was willing to bend the knee to Donald Trump on immigration so as to ensure non-contamination of the trade agenda is a man who today does understand the critical importance of Mexico's economic and trade relationship with the United States. So I do want to start by underscoring that, because this is not your López Obrador of 2006, at least in regards to this issue of the economic and trade relationship in North America. But beyond that, I don't see any strategic appetite by the president in capitalizing the opportunity that of having an administration today in Washington that probably has the president in the Oval Office with the greatest mileage, understanding, engagement, experience in the relationship with Mexico and in the relationship with Latin America. On the other hand, you've got an administration in Washington that seems to have fallen into what I've been calling an Erdogan trap, pressed by the fundamental need to ensure operation control of the border, to diminish transmigration flows through Mexico. It seems so far to have decided to ensure at all costs that Mexico continues to collaborate with Washington on this very important issue, but seems less willing in public or in private, certainly in public, to address some of these domestic policy issues that down the road could have a profound impact on the well-being and security of the United States, let alone the bilateral relationship. And I know I'm being a bit here, I'm crying wolf, but the danger is that at some point, policymakers on Capitol Hill or in the administration, in 3-4 years, suddenly start asking the question, when and how did we lose Mexico?
Yeah, no, it's a compelling vision, but that's exactly the point that I want to get to. So we've talked about the North American agenda. We've talked about the strategic importance of the bilateral as well as the trilateral relationship, if you include Canada. Very important topics, core elements of U.S. well-being. I would argue core elements certainly of Mexican well-being as well. But, the mood in Washington has shifted in terms of our trade partners, our partners generally around the world. People are demanding a certain democratic practice, a certain human rights practice, things like this. And I guess I'm hearing a number of people worry that, the trends south of the border are going in the wrong direction. That makes the relationship more complicated to sustain as a political matter in Washington, if nothing else. I wonder if you would agree with that, or if you could help us tease that out a little bit.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the worrying trends that I've been looking at and that I've been concerned about, which is this slippery slope of slow degradation of Mexico's democratic institutions and checks and balances. And again, you see it happening all over the place. You see it with regulators that are being whose autonomy is being eliminated, and they're being made part of the ministries of which they substantively relate to. You see it with some of the critically important autonomous institutions, the central bank, the National Electoral Institute, the Institute for Access to Information. All of these institutions, which López Obrador paradoxically sees as institutions built by the toffs, the elites, the mafia of power. And I say paradoxically because it's all of these institutions that in many ways paved the way for López Obrador's victory in 2018. But they all constrain his power, and what he has been doing is recreating an imperial presidency that we had not seen in Mexico since the heyday of the PRI. And that is a very troubling development. And it's one where I think both Capitol Hill and the administration and others in the media need to start speaking up. You don't have to go to war over it, because it will make other issues much more challenging with a president who tends to use a nationalistic playbook, particularly regarding foreign policy, and how in his sort of very Westphalian view of national sovereignty, which is why he was happy as a clam with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, beyond the issue of the border, didn't care less about what happened in Mexico, and which is one of the concerns, I think, in the president's mind regarding this administration in Washington today, that they will eventually start speaking up, which I hope they do. But this is a very, very pressing issue. And again, particularly when you have a Mexican president, who in the coming years will be thinking of one thing only: how to not find himself in the situation come December the 1st, 2024, where he will have to hand the presidential sash to someone not from his own party. And I think that is going to be López Obrador's obsession between now and the presidential elections in 2024. And that, given what we've seen so far, does not bode well for a president who is using the bully pulpit to create a narrative of us versus them, of polarizing, of resorting to alternative facts, and sort of in many ways, policy-wise, of sort of turning the clock back. Energy policy, the world paradigm is moving in one direction, and Mexico's energy paradigm is moving back 2-3 decades.
Yeah, you and I interact, and the Council of the Americas interact on a daily basis with investors and people who have been in Mexico for many, many years, and others who want to be there, perhaps. But I want to exactly pursue that point that you just raised at the end. Look, Mexico's growth has underperformed, and projections that I've seen recently would have, coming out of COVID, continued underperformance. Over the last generation, the growth has been investment led. So you put those two together, you realize that investment really is required, more investments required for Mexico's economy to really begin to achieve the rates of growth that many people think that it could have and indeed should have. But all the issues we've been talking about are clearly impacting the mood of investors, in terms of Mexico and the sustainability of investments, the decision-making process, and how an investment once made, is it secure? Obviously, when USMCA was changed from NAFTA and the investor state clause was changed, it actually made Mexico's investment climate less attractive for U.S. and Canadian investors. And that was actually, ironically, at the behest of the U.S. trade representative. So I'm still trying to wrap my arms around that one. But, it is what it is. We have the USMCA. So there's a lot of finger pointing, I suppose, that could go around. But let's pursue that point, because if investment is required to get Mexico's economy really moving forward in a positive and favorable way, and yet you mentioned energy, which has been a huge issue for U.S. and Canadian and other investors. We could also throw in the pension system. We could also throw in others. I mean, how should investors be looking at Mexico right now in the context of the rest of the global economy, where they have other options, they have other choices for relocation of supply chains? This is a complicated issue, isn't it?
Yeah, and it doesn't have a sort of a linear or sort of, there isn't an easy response here. Let's say at the wholesale level, I think it's clear that the promise of North America is there, and Mexico is part of that promise. If we do the right things in the coming months and years, particularly again as Washington rethinks policy towards China, as Washington hopefully understands that Build Back Better has to be Build Back Better together in North America, that Canada and Mexico are key in that paradigm, not only of enhanced economic well-being in the US homeland, but also in terms of North American competitiveness globally. The promise of North America, and despite I'm one who thinks that USMCA was sort of, USMCA was surviving to fight another day. It's got some very important achievements, which it modernized an edifice that was negotiated when Amazon and eBay and e-commerce didn't exist. Sort of, it now has disciplines that didn't exist 30 years ago, which is a very important thing given where our economies are moving and how services play a role in the North American economies. But there are other parts of USMCA which do seem to be a step backwards. Automotive is clearly one area where the new thresholds of North American content are a handicap in our ability not to sell cars in North America, to sell cars in Asia. And so, having said this, I think that if you look at this from 35,000 feet, the promise of Mexico, the promise of an economically integrated Mexico with two North American partners is huge, and it should be a huge incentive for investment in the country. But then if you go down into the weeds and sort of at ground level, then you start seeing some of these troubling signs, and most of those today are happening in the energy sector, which is where Mexico seems intent on going backwards, in pedaling that bicycle backwards. And much like Maggie Thatcher famously responded once in questions and answers with the Prime Minister in Westminster, this gentleman, López Obrador, doesn't seem to be for making a U-turn on these issues. And forget what that does to investment that's already on the ground. So many companies that have operations in Mexico, whether they're Mexican or foreign, their stockholders, their boards are demanding that their energy sources be from renewables and clean energy sources. Many of these companies are going to have problems if they're operating in Mexico and they can't access clean energy because of some of the policies that the current Mexican government is implementing regarding renewables, regarding wind, electric, solar, and re-centralizing so much power in the two state-owned companies, Pemex and CFE. So it is a very troubling development there.
Yeah, and the whole clean energy revolution, which has already begun, but certainly is going to accelerate, it almost positions Mexico outside of the ability to even compete for that new investment, much less keep the investment, just as you say, that is going to begin to require those clean energy sources just to continue its own activities. It's a really important point.
When you would need alignment, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, to build upon that paradigm of clean, efficient, self-sufficient, and secure energy for North America, which I think should be one of the paradigms that we should be striving to achieve in the coming years as we think of the three North American partners, and which fits right into the Biden administration's priority on the green economy, on climate change, on renewables.
Yeah, absolutely. Arturo, in the 2 or 3 minutes that we have remaining, I want to ask you a final question. Both the United States and Mexico have presidential elections in 2024. Our electoral cycles coincide again, and it's going to be a really important year for both countries, obviously. I wonder if you have, I know it's early days, I know that nobody will hold anybody to any sort of predictions. I'm not asking for predictions, but do you have a prognosis in terms of how we should be viewing 2024 in the context of the U.S.-Mexico democracy agenda?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I'm not going to go into putting out their bets and what's going to happen in the actual election. But I do think it's going to be a critically important electoral cycle for both countries. As you mentioned, every 12 years, our presidential cycles coincide. When that has happened in the past, it's usually been an opportunity for revamping, resetting, relaunching the bilateral relationship. The fact that we don't know exactly what's going to be happening in the United States in 2024, whether we're going to see a GOP that continues to be intent on scuppering democracy, whether Donald Trump will make a run again. Imagine Donald Trump back on the scene and the impact that would have on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. I shudder to think. But in Mexico also, precisely because of what we're seeing of the president targeting one of the institutions that is being key in Mexico's fuller democracy, which is the National Electoral Institute, which has provided certainty, reliability in the past Mexican presidential elections since 1994, and it has been a cornerstone of Mexico's maturing democracy. So if you reach 2024 with some of the trends that we're watching in the U.S., with some of the trends that we're watching in Mexico, I'd be getting very jittery
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, back in my early days, I was actually an election judge in my home state of Illinois. And I can tell you that there are well-meaning, very, impressive citizens who are doing this out of a sense of corporate citizenship and corporate in terms of collective citizenship and responsibility. I can only speak for the U.S. in some ways, not Mexico, but that whole model is coming into question if we don't have impartial, objective election judges and observers and the whole mechanics of democracy. Then the results become much more complicated indeed. You've pointed to a really important point. It's at some level, it's not about the candidates, it's about the system, and we need to make sure that the system remains intact. And Mexico has done a huge amount of positive work in that regard. You've been part of that. Some of our mutual friends have been directly part of that as well. It is something that has set Mexico aside, if I can say, in a positive way in the minds of international observers for a long time. And we really do hope, indeed, with the United States too, that will continue. Arturo Sarukhan, I would love to continue this conversation. Our time is unfortunately at an end, but perhaps we can get you back at some point to continue this conversation. These democracy dialogues have been having quite a positive impact in highlighting some of the most pressing issues around the hemisphere. And I really want to thank you for your wisdom, your insights, your willingness to join us to speak so openly and frankly, even in an on-the-record environment, and obviously for your personal friendship as well. Arturo Sarukhan, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to conclude our session of Democracy Dialogues. We hope you will join us again very soon when we will continue the series with another fascinating conversation about the state of democracy in the Americas. Have a terrific day.